This documentary is about a man who, in our opinion, was one of the most influential leaders of the 20th century. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was President of the United States from 1932 until 1944. He captained our nation for 12 years before succumbing to a brain aneurysm in 1945. He showed great leadership from the beginning of his presidency, coming into office during the Great Depression. Within the first 100 days in office, most of the laws that became known as the New Deal were passed. The New Deal provided recovery and relief to the American people and reform to the government and the financial system so that a disaster of this scale could never happen again. Then, with the problems of the Great Depression still front and center, the United States was drawn into World War II. FDR displayed leadership as commander-in-chief of our nation's military. He surrounded himself with many advisors so that he could make informed decisions on the war. He created the Joint Chiefs of Staff and organized many other programs to keep Britain in fighting shape. During the war, FDR structured his program so the alliance between the Big Three was run from Washington. The men he appointed to leadership in the Army and Navy proved to be effective and influential leaders throughout the war. This eventually led to our victory in 1945 after FDR's death.
Roosevelt was born on January 30th, 1882 in Hyde Park, New York, to James Roosevelt and Sarah Ann Delano. FDR grew up in an atmosphere of privilege and attended a boarding school in Massachusetts, Harvard College, and Columbia Law School. During this time, he married Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor's uncle, Theodore Roosevelt, then President of the U.S., gave her away at their wedding. Franklin was hired at a law firm on Wall Street. It was also during this time that FDR began his long-time affair with Lucy Mercer.
In 1913, FDR was appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy under Woodrow Wilson. While in this position, he worked to expand the Navy and created the U.S. Navy Reserves. He ran for political office several times, but lost.
In 1921, FDR contracted polio, which left him permanently paralyzed from the waist down. He tried a wide variety of treatments, and in 1926 bought a resort in Warm Springs, Georgia, and founded a hydrotherapy center for other polio patients. He then went on to found the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis. His disability greatly affected his political life, as FDR wanted to project the image of a strong leader, not one that was paralyzed. So, he created iron leg braces and taught himself to walk short distances with a cane. He only drove a car with hand controls. Only in private did he use a wheelchair. Great care was taken to prevent the press from highlighting his disability. This was so effective that only 2 photos of FDR in a wheelchair exist today.
In 1929, FDR was elected governor of New York and served in this position until he was elected president in 1932. As governor, he started many new social programs. While running for a second term, it was alleged that he used the Tammany Hall political machine. While his opponent pointed this out, the Republican nominee couldn't overcome the public's blame of his party for the Great Depression, and Roosevelt was re-elected by a margin of 14%. During Roosevelt's first term as governor of New York, the stock market collapsed, losing $14 billion and setting off the Great Depression. The incumbent President Hoover didn't do much to help things. Due to Hoover's strong belief in rugged individualism, he felt it was better to let people die than offer them help. This didn't win him many supporters. Then, when Hoover ordered the U.S. military to open fire on the veterans and the bonus army, the public completely lost faith in him. FDR ran against Hoover in 1932 election and won 57% of the vote, winning all but 6 states.
FDR was inaugurated on March 4, 1933. A quarter of the workforce was unemployed. Industry had lost over half its production since 1929. 2 million people were homeless, prices had fallen 60%, and 32 states had closed their banks. In short, our country was in the midst of the worst depression the world had ever seen. Roosevelt's answer to this was the New Deal, characterized by relief, recovery, and reform. During the first 100 days of his administration, he enacted many laws to give relief to the people. The day after his inauguration, he declared a bank holiday, which closed every bank in the nation. He then signed the law to create the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, a program for the federal government to insure banks. He enacted programs to get the unemployed working, such as the Works Progress Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and the Tennessee Valley Authority. These programs hired over 250,000 people. He also created the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which paid farmers $1 an acre to leave their land fallow. In 1934, he created the Securities and Exchange Commission. to oversee the stock market and shut it down if too much was lost in one day. He also repealed prohibition. In 1935, Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act, which provided a set income to the elderly, widows, and orphans. He also passed the National Labor Relations Act, which established the rights of workers to organize, engage in strikes, and collectively bargain. These measures seemed to have an effect as unemployment fell to 14.3% by 1937.
The U.S. was neutral in World War II until 1941. The president supported that stance. However, he sought many ways to help Britain and France's militaries without actually committing troops. This help was given despite the many isolationists in the Congress who held strongly to the Monroe Doctrine and said that we shouldn't get involved in another European war. One of the ways FDR helped was with the creation of the Lend-Lease Act, which made it possible for the U.S. to give military aid to Britain, China, and later the Soviet Union with no payment required till after the war. Later, the money paid back from the Lend-Lease Act accumulated to around $50 billion. The U.S. provided World War I destroyers to the Britain in exchange for base rates to their bases in the Caribbean. In 1940, Roosevelt again won the election, defying the tradition of a two-term presidency.
As early as July 1941, the Empire of Japan had been threatening American bases in the Pacific. They invaded the Dutch East Indies and French Indochina, moving their forces closer to the Philippines. In response, FDR cut off U.S. exports to Japan, reducing their oil supply by 95%. Then, suddenly, on December 7, 1941, the Empire of Japan launched a sneak attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. This attack knocked out the main American battleship fleet and killed 2,403 servicemen and civilians. Simultaneously, they also bombed U.S. bases in the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, and Midway. The next day, FDR gave his well-known infamy speech to Congress asking them to declare war on Japan. On that day, the U.S. declared war on the Axis powers. The next day, Britain and Australia declared war on Japan, and Germany declared war on the United States. Roosevelt created a new branch of advisors known as the Joint Chiefs of Staff. These were included the Chief of Staff of Army, Navy, and the Air Force.
From the bombing of Pearl Harbor to the invasion of Normandy, FDR worked closely with Churchill and Stalin, orchestrating the demise of the Axis powers. With the war drawing close in 1944, the leaders of three major Allied powers met in Yalta to discuss the future of Europe after the war.
Upon his return to the United States, FDR was exhausted. He traveled to his home in Warm Springs, Georgia. His health had been steadily getting worse since the war began. FDR was now a chain smoker, lost 40 to 50 pounds since his first election, and looked easily 10 years older than when the war first began. He was anxious to get to Warm Springs so that he could see his longtime mistress, Lucy Mercer Rutherford, who was meeting him there. Lucy brought her artist friend along to paint a portrait of FDR to show a better image of him than the latest press photographs, which displayed FDR as very sickly. On the morning of April 12th, FDR woke up and ate a light breakfast. As his picture was painted, Franklin did some light work and read the newspaper. FDR suddenly slumped forward and cried out, "I have a terrific pain in the back of my head," and then sank into unconsciousness. As help was summoned and FDR was carried into the bedroom, Lucy realized how bad this looked, and she and the artist left quickly. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was pronounced dead at 3:35 p.m. on April 12, 1945.
Later that day, Harry Truman was sworn in as the 33rd President of the United States. On April 15th, FDR's funeral parade ran through Washington, D.C., and he was laid to rest in his estate in Hyde Park, New York. Truman later authorized the use of nuclear weapons against Japan that were developed under the Manhattan Project, authorized by FDR. On September 2nd, 1945, the war was over and a total of 72 million people had died.
FDR's legacy is more than evident in the United States. His leadership through the worst financial crisis in history gave relief to many people who had lost everything. He created jobs and enacted laws to ensure that nothing like the Great Depression could ever happen again. Throughout the war, FDR proved himself to be an able leader. His foresight brought about the creation of the atomic bomb and a whole new age of warfare. Though he died before its completion, his steady hand led us through the deadliest war in human history and stopped the spread of fascism in its tracks. Franklin Roosevelt's pioneering of the New Deal and his actions throughout World War II brought the United States out of the Great Depression and into a new era of prosperity.